Fantasy is not so much a suspension of disbelief as it is an acceptance of our own unconsciousness. Fantasy is as old as man, beginning back in our animal history, when someone had the first abstract thought. In our Western society, empirical data and rational thought have become the touchstones of experience. This is worse than cutting off half your body. The fantastic is easily half of the universe, whether you count galaxies and nucleoids, or court a demon in a pinnacle. Greg Stafford. Welcome to Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to welcome everyone back after our week off last week, and I hope you enjoy this week's special kind of supplementary or bonus episode, kind of go along with the spooky Halloween season, as it were. So from the introduction, you might be able to kind of guess where we're going if you are familiar with some fantasy gaming or tabletop gaming tropes. You may recognize the name that I quoted from Mr. Greg Stafford. This week we're going to be diving into the World of Glorantha. Now, for those of you that are unaware, Glorantha is it's a fantasy world, and it was created by Greg Stafford. It's kind of one of the first, well, I won't say the first, but it was a early competitor with Dungeons and Dragons, which of course was created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. I think they first published in 1974. Glorantha was first published in 1975. The thing that kind of makes Glorantha stand out a bit as opposed to Dungeons and Dragons, however, is that it doesn't quite use as much inspiration as Lord of the Rings type elements as Dungeons and Dragons do. There are some similarities. I think you could kind of think of this world as being more focused on the classic swashbuckling sword and sorceries books, similar to Ron Howard, I think is the name of the guy that did the original Conan the Barbarian, and some other series, John Connors of Mars, that kind of thing. So think of it more kind of being influenced by like 20s and 30s serials, that kind of fantasy as opposed to more Tolkien-esque fantasy. And we're going to get into that specific, some of the differences, we'll get into some of the differences in general. But first, we just want to focus on, I guess, the world, as it were. This was brought to my attention, or suggested that I cover this, by a couple of friends of mine, Kyle, and streamer X of Mega Team Up. You may, if you follow our Twitter account, you may have seen me interact with them a couple of times. They are some friends of mine, and they do their own thing on YouTube and Twitch. And we may actually do a partner-up episode for one of the games that was inspired by this fantasy world, but that's still in the future. I do want to do an episode with those guys about some other stuff. Specifically beer brewing. Kyle of Mega Team Up is himself an avid brewer, so I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you do as well. But I think let's get back to Greg Stafford, the man who kind of created this world. Now, Greg was born in February 1948, and he just passed within, I think, 2018, October of 2018. According to minutes. And he was a very prolific game designer. He did quite a bit of tabletop things. He worked on Call of Cthulhu, which, of course, if you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, or those games are kind of based on his mythos. He also did some work on Arthurian games, I think Merlin, as well as there was like a King Arthur, I think it's just called King Arthur. as well as some other stuff. But I think the initial work for this world, or the initial publishing work of this world, was White Bear and Red Moon. And it has been published in a few other works as well. I think Hero Quest is what I knew of the world, knew of the world initially from Hero Quest, RuneQuest, and also I was able to find a game that's like a single player on mobile. It's called King of Dragon Pass. That is also set in the world of Glorantha. And I played a few hours actually on my trip. It was something I could play on my phone during the flights I was on with airplane mode engaged. It doesn't require you to be constantly in a network or anything. But let's kind of talk about what the world is and what makes it unique. So Glorantha takes place in a world very much influenced by the mythical and magical. Think of their world as being inside of a sphere, and at the top of the sphere, or I guess the top half, you have the sun and the moon that would go along into the water, come around the world, and then emerge into the sphere the next day. Now, the water actually takes up the bottom half of the sphere, and this is the sea, and then you have the world itself, which is on one side of a cube, and then the other sides of the cube are submerged beneath the water, and they lead, of course, at the very bottom level to the underworld, which is also connected to the ocean. So it's not a flat world, it's a cubed world that is suspended in a half-filled sphere of water. And the gods are real in this kind of situation, or this world, and they are active. They are, they're powerful. They don't necessarily have paladins or clerics as you would see in like D&D, but they do have influence over humanity. In fact, humans are kind of pawns to the gods. They play an active role in, religious rituals as well as cults and things like that. And the sun, the earth, the air, the water, all these things are gods. And then, of course, different aspects of nature, death, life, rebirth, stasis, change, truth. These are all kind of deities as well. And then there are lesser deities, that are, they're just like gods of cows, gods of ships, gods of volcanoes or individual volcanoes, things like that. And of course, there are humans that occupy this world, and they kind of make up, what we've already talked about a little bit of this in our regular episodes. You have hunter-gatherer cultures. Specifically, I think the two that stand out in the kind of the lore of the world are the Sunshin and the Dorati. But then you also have a nomadic pastoralist, and their culture is known as Praxian. And then you have the more, shall we say, warlike tribal chieftains that work metal. These are the Orlanthi. And then you have the more civilized urban civilizations. These are represented by a few different groups, but I think Fonritian, Western, Kralorlan, and Pelorian cultures. And one thing I mentioned about Glorantha not being focused on Tolkien aspects, yes, he has things like elves and dwarves. However, these are very different to how you would think of in like the Tolkien mythos. The elves they look human, at least on the surface, but they are more akin to sentient plants that kind of move around. So they have very long lives. They don't really need to eat other than water. Then you have dwarves who are they are mortal, like the elves in Tolkien, but these dwarves are made of stone, and they seek to kind of to fix the world, which is kind of in a bad shape after it had been broken during the wars between the gods. Then you have trolls or Uz, and that's UZ. These are strictly, underworld demons. They're meant to fight against, pawns of the gods of light. And they also have their own version of Dragonborn called Dragon Newts, and these are kind of a they're dragon people, and they kind of endlessly reincarnate with memories of their past lives. Like every time they die, they inherit everything from their previous selves. And they're kind of like an all-knowing, unknowable race, that kind of trope. And in terms of time frame, I think it's kind of hard to say exactly. And of course, because this is something like D&D, you can edit the world as needed if you were running the game. It's not something that has to be set at a specific time frame. However, I think a lot of the art and mythos of the world that's included in a lot of the source books, it might be easier to think of this as kind of as more of a Bronze Age world. Think about the Middle East, and actually the next set of not the next set, but the first sets of cultures we'll talk about, things like Babylon, Egypt, places like that, Bronze Age civilizations. That is something that you see a lot of, at least when it comes to city type dwellings. The art style that's presented in those books, temple complexes, that is what you would get in Glorantha, as opposed to, say, cities of glass and light that you might run into in D&D. And then, of course, you have the pastoralists or the tribal chieftains. Those might be more akin to, something like you'll see in the early European history, where you have, tribal chieftains working bronze, trading cattle or sheep, working together against a foe, then working against that former ally. A lot of shifting alliances. Think more Conan and the Conan barbarian stories, as opposed to the cities that he kind of pillages and raids. So Glorantha is very, very different than D&D, at least in terms of, I guess, its flavor, for lack of a better term. It is also a little bit less of a war gaming. You can do that in Glorantha. It's not necessarily mutually exclusive, because again, D&D, you don't necessarily have to war game either. But Glorantha, I think, is a bit more designed to be a bit more heavy on the role playing, a little bit less of focus on the combat. So it's probably not quite for everyone, but if you were looking for something that's a little more, shall we say, diplomacy focused, it might be a good starting point. And in addition to those changes, I guess, kind of to Tolkien's lore, there are they have a few different things that are unique to Glorantha. Specifically, I know they have a race of duckmen. They just are very large, intelligent ducks, except instead of wings, they have like feathery arms and webbed feet. And I think they're called Durlus or Duruls. Then, of course, there are scorpion-like centaurs. So the top half is human, the bottom half is scorpion with the tail. And then, of course, you have a few other things like that kind of differentiate it from a more Tolkien-esque fantasy world. So that's kind of the world. That's some of the, I guess, not characters, but some of the races that inhabit the world. I want to go back and talk a little bit about the creator. Greg Stafford is a very interesting dude. Um, he he was a noted shaman or shamanist practices. He actually was a member of Shaman's Drum, which is like a journal um, that is devoted to like experimental shamanism, and it was published for a number of years between the 80s and 2000s. And it just kind of, wanted, I guess, a little bit more esoteric or spiritual work in, I guess, to be brought to like Western attention. They focused on things like ayahuasca rituals, different kinds of Tibetan practices, like Tibetan Buddhist practices, and of course they focused on other like North American, Native American phenomena or cultural touchstones as well. It's very he was a very interesting guy. I wish I had heard about him, and I had heard his name before in association to like Call of Cthulhu stuff, but I didn't realize that he was so like he had done so much in terms of like gaming conventions. I think he also did like a board game version for Ghostbusters of all things. So yeah, he was in a lot of things, or he worked on a lot of things. And the game I spoke of that I got on Android was King of Dragons Past, or King of Dragon Past, excuse me. You can get that yourself. It is available, I think, on iOS and Android. And I think you can also get it on Windows as well. I'm not sure if it's on Steam, but you shouldn't have a hard time finding it. It runs well on your phone. Like if you have any kind of recent, within the last 5 or 6 years phone, it'll run no problem. Hell, probably an older phone as well. It's very much text-based. The goal is to become the titular King of Dragon Pass. Even though you don't play as individual characters, you play as a ring, or like I guess a tribal kind of leadership group over a single tribe in this Dragon Pass area. And of course you interact with other tribes. You engage in things like diplomacy, cattle raids, you build up your settlement, you perform rituals, sacrifice to gods. You have to perform specific journeys or quests, and these are ritual quests to kind of repeat a past act of valor by a god or a hero of your group to try to obtain specific items or knowledge. It's very in depth. It is not easy. I started a couple of different playthroughs on my trip. Some went much better than others. So I'd recommend creating a lot of save states and going back and forth. I think to actually complete and become the king, you do have to kind of cheese the game a little bit. Otherwise, you just, you have to get extremely lucky. But essentially, you're kind of semi-nomadic band of tribesmen move into a region along with several others, and your goal is to expand your numbers, recruit warriors, defend yourselves, attack enemies, perform these quests to get items of power, and eventually take over the entire region. So, and I recommend it, especially if you're going to have long flights like I did. It's pretty fun. It's simple. It's easy to play, hard to master. But even if you're not winning, quote unquote, there's still a lot of good and interesting art for the kind of the quests. Some of it's very well done. Some of it it's funny, but it's entertaining, and it's beautiful in some cases. So, and it kind of gives you a feel for the world. I like specifically the quests that you go on, because you're repeating. In most cases, you're repeating the actions of a god, and you're trying to follow in their footsteps to gain the items or knowledge that they did to help your people. And there is the theory, and I'm sure that Mr. Stafford, being a shaman himself, recognized that was kind of, or that is a major theory of how religious ceremonies began. That our ancestors were repeating what had been done in the past so that the same thing would happen again. That's always been a very popular theory for how religious ceremonies arose. So he kind of takes that and he turns it up to 11 with how the mechanics of that work. And I'm not going to go into specifics because, again, there's quite a number. I think there's over 20 quests that you have to perform and then complete. There are multiple choices that you can make at every step of the quests. And if you make the wrong one even once, well, it's kind of a it's kind of a mess if you don't know what you're doing, or if you're just guessing, as I was. So, but yeah, it's a very interesting world, and if it's especially something if you're not as interested in wargaming, or if you'd like to think of it more as a problem-solving game as opposed to wargaming. It doesn't have to be diplomatic, but you do have to come up with more unique ideas of how to fix things sometimes, or how to break things in certain situations. Yeah, so it's a good time. It's a good game. King of Dragon Pass, and the world itself is very interesting. It is a lot different than a bunch of other fantasy worlds out there, because so many of them have been so heavily influenced by Tolkien or by D&D, which is the more well-known, tabletop option. But if you're tired of Dungeons and Dragons, or if you just want to play something else, and then I know there's Pathfinder, which is also similar to Dungeons and Dragons, but it is very much based kind of in a similar world as that. So if you want something, similar to those old school Conan the Barbarian sword and sorcery games, sword and sorcery books or stories or comics, you might want to check out this game. And it's not quite as complicated in terms of rules as from what I can tell. They only use D20s. There are no additional like D6s, D8s, anything like that. At least some of the older ones. I don't know about the new versions. I wasn't able to get as much information on those. But yeah, so if you'd like to try something different, I'd recommend giving it a shot. But yeah. I think that's pretty much all I need to talk about with Glorantha this week. Next week, we're going to come back. I'm going to do another kind of a special episode. I think this upcoming week it's going to be on the Westeros Game of Thrones, but way before anything else, to kind of go into the more mythological aspects of the show, based on the World of Ice and Fire source book. And that's something I'm looking forward to. I'm a very big fan of the books. And I know they have a currently new version of the show, which takes place like before the Game of Thrones books. I haven't watched the show yet. I've already read the books. I know what happens. So I'm just going to kind of wait and see, and hopefully hope it turns out well. It sounds like it's doing good, though. It's doing a lot better than some other high-profile fantasy shows recently. So, but yeah, I am back from my trip. It was very fun, very mostly relaxing. Did have a little bit of a issue with my travel on the return. It's odd. The first time I'm not in the area for a major hurricane like this, it still affects me, even though I'm not anywhere near. Our flight was initially supposed to leave, I think, Friday in the early afternoon to get back very late Friday evening. However, that did not happen. They went ahead and canceled us Thursday afternoon, so we ended up having to stay an extra day in LA, which wasn't bad, but the the very early flight we had to take Saturday morning, we had to be at the airport a little before 4 to actually get in line and get through checks and all that before we could board. So that was a bit rough. So I am a little tired still. I'm trying to readjust my sleep schedule. It hasn't been too bad, but it's catching up with me now, even though it's only 10 o'clock here now. So I still have a couple days before I have to get back to the office, thankfully. So I'm going to try and use Monday and Tuesday to kind of get my sea legs back under me, as it were. But I hope everyone enjoys this. It's a simple little episode. It's just something that it kind of allows me to do things and keep content out while I'm working on, I guess, the more hardcore history things. So if you have anything else, if you enjoyed it, if you have any feedback on this, please let me know. I'll include the link to my friends if you were interested in their stuff. I'll try to mention them in the Twitter feed as well. But yeah, I hope you've all enjoyed. I hope you enjoy our next episode, which I think is going to be on Game of Thrones. I may switch it up though. I have to just sit down and write out my little script there. I will try to have the domestication episode up to kind of include that as a real episode with the next bonus episode. I don't know if it'll be out next week. It might be out the week after. I still have to kind of work things out and see how I feel during the week. And hopefully my office isn't too bad a shape when I get back in on Wednesday. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and please feel free to give me any feedback. Oh, also, Audacity, the software I use to record the episode, has had an update. If there are any audio issues, please tell me, and I'll try to adjust. But thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.